Yeah, again, welcome to everybody. I guess everyone is on different time zones. So it could be morning to some, afternoon to others, and already evening, especially for our speaker for today. So today's workshop is about discussing the key proposals concerning fair taxation, okay, of multinationals at an international level. And that includes, of course, how do we tax these what are called now tech giants, companies such as Facebook or Amazon or Google, right? So we have an expert with us. His name is Jason Judd. He works for the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability. A mouthful, he said in the video, right? So this is designed to be a workshop, so we expect and encourage everyone to be ready and open for discussion. So we've decided to have a lot of time for questions from participants from the floor. But we can have Jason kick off the workshop by discussing a bit about the latest developments concerning tax negotiations at the OECD level. So good evening there, Jason.
Good evening. Hello to everyone, and thanks for having me. Coming at you from Sydney, Australia here, so it is in the evening, but very happy to be here and happy that everyone's interested in learning more about tax. So I spend all my time thinking about tax, for the better or worse. So thought I would just start off with a quick kind of update on where things are at with the current global discussions on OECD tax reform. And I think since we began talking about these lecture series, the process has further evolved and come forward. And I think in large part kind of given a step forward with a change of administrations in the United States. So with Biden coming along and really pushing globally for minimum global tax, whereas the previous US administration under Trump had basically stopped any progress from being made on those discussions at the OECD. So now we're in a situation where I think about 140 countries, under the OECD-driven inclusive framework process have signed up to these two tax reform proposals, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. There's quite a lot of concern about their lack of being effective, and particularly in terms of the lack of fairness in terms between the global South and the global North. And I think all of those concerns are absolutely very valid. Is designed to replace the efforts that lots of countries and economic blocs were taking in relation to digital service taxes. There's very widespread acknowledgement at all levels across the world that sort of the biggest tech companies in the world, who are now, amongst the largest companies the planet has ever seen, are aggressively avoiding their taxes. And obviously, as they grow bigger and bigger, that problem becomes more has a greater impacts. So Pillar 1 is only targeting the essentially top 100 companies, a lot of whom are these tech giants. It is pretty ineffective in my view in terms of its scope, but the one good thing about the Pillar 1 approach is that it does legitimize what I spoke about in the lecture is a unitary tax approach, but sadly, it's only looking at the unitary approach on what they refer to as residual or excess profits. So we're not that optimistic in terms of its long-term impact, and I think that sort of there are better ways to approach. I am much more supportive and optimistic around Pillar 2, which is a global minimum tax rate. And currently the rate being discussed is 15%. I think it's very worthy for everyone to push for that to be raised immediately, and to push it up as well in future. So there could be a situation where it starts at a one rate and then goes up over time. But I think 15% is too low, but it's a significant step above the 0% corporate tax rate that currently exists in many, many tax havens around the world. It does have problems in terms of being unfair in that the global north and the home countries for these multinationals stand to benefit the most. But I think what it begins to do is it takes out competition and it sets a floor. And so if you're a big global tech company headquartered in the United States, if you're booking revenues in Bermuda where the tax rate is 0, it will eventually force those countries, if the United States is going to take that 15% anyway, you might as well keep it. So I think over time we'll see corporate structures changing, and we'll see the rules in lots of different countries around having very, very low tax rates change over time, because it will create, there's no incentive for you not to collect that revenue from the country perspective. And if you're a multinational, you might as well pay taxes and take some credit and get some goodwill for that in countries where you operate. So I think that the potential for Pillar 2 and a global minimum to change and move forward in the right direction is very strong. I mean, it is highly problematic, but there's some, I think that is a significant and major positive step forward overall.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, for that. So the way I understand it, like there are things that are happening, right? So there are now actually proposals on how to tax multinational corporations, including the tech giants. Although from like a progressive point of view, there's still a lot that is lacking in terms of how we could still actually stem tax avoidance. Yeah. So I guess we can open the floor for questions from participants, anything related specific to what Jason had just said, or anything actually related to our general topic for today of how do we actually, what are the concrete proposals on taxing multinationals and tech giants? So any questions from the room? Yeah, Stephanie, and then after that I see one. So let's have Stephanie first.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm in Berlin, so it's shortly after 10 o'clock. My question would be how we as a group or in this seminar are going to define fair, because that's what we are going to talk about. And I think that having these different international perspectives on this topic, I think we also might have different definitions of what we call fair. So maybe also Jason can just reply to that, what he or we think is fair in terms of like minimum wages or environmental standards. Thank you.
Would you like to answer, Jason, before I call on the next, right? Would you rather
Sure. If I could just provide a quick answer to that. I mean, I think, fair, it's a very good question, because I think any notion of fairness is all very relative. I think one of the key factors here is where the fairness comes into play is the distribution. So I think there's worldwide agreement that these companies should be paying more revenue, more taxes. The question is, where does that tax revenue end up and how is it shared? And I think that we need to, the primary way and the argument that gets pushed in the global north and the systems that are used currently in a place like the United States to allocate revenues are based entirely on sales. And that it works within a US system where there's different states make it relatively more fair, but it doesn't work in a global system. And I think we absolutely have to include labor and production and where workers are, and that has to be part of a formula for distribution. I would even go so far as to push other metrics in order to create fair formulas. And the most simplest and easiest one could be population, because a lot of the value of a company like Facebook is the data that it collects. So it would be more accurate to reflect revenues based on data collection and kind of the penetration of internet use or social media use. But in some ways, the fairest way to do it would just be purely on a formula that takes into effect population. And at some point down the road, a country that has a large population but lower levels of social media usage, things will change, and that will become more of a metric and more of the company's future value. And with a lot of this, in terms of the tech companies and data, a lot of this it's not the value, and this is the problem with some of the digital services taxes, that they're trying to tax digital ad value. And really, that's not the value of these companies. The value is the data, and it's the ability to target those ads in a highly effective way, perhaps 5 years from now, after you've collected data from every individual on the planet. So there's scary implications of that in terms of privacy and who controls that data as well. But I think a lot more needs to be focused on in terms of the fairness question.
Yeah, before I call on Juan, do you just have any follow-up, Stephanie, concerning Jason's? Yeah, okay. So I can call on, may I call on Juan? I think Juan had his hand up earlier, right? Hello, Juan. Are you ready for your question? Maybe I'll skip Juan first and then call on Philip.
Hi everyone. Okay, sure. I'm a bit late, and then also I'm gonna leave around 10:30. I mean, okay. Yeah. I don't know if I digress, but I got a problem already with money economy. Because money economy, if I'm a gangster, I go rob honest people money, and then when I go to spend it, people respect me. I've got a lot of money. They don't ask me how I got that money. And then this is creating a lot of problems in South Africa. We got a lot of violent crime, innocent people robbed by gangster. And then these people are respected in the economy because they have nice cars, they've got, and then you go on corruption. Comes in many ways. There is also a sophisticated corruption, which is made by the government officials. They steal a lot of money, and then we don't ask how they got this money. We respect them because they've got nice cars, they've got nice house, and that's consumerism. We all care about what kind of clothes you're wearing. And then this again, so everyone is an aspirant. We all want to live, the American dream. And then it comes in all in languages, like through soapies in the TV, and then and so on. And then now, if a company like Nike is doing a sweatshop somewhere in South America, and then like where people are locked and they're paying people very little money, and then again they're destroying the environment, and they bring to sell their goods here in South Africa, and then even if maybe you know that, okay, these goods are, even I've seen activists people in the left who claim to be revolutionaries, and then they will be still wearing those clothes whom it's well known that these clothes is made somewhere in China. Workers are committing suicide because of the way they are being treated. And then how do we now, I mean, deal with a situation like that? Because it seems there's no political will at all to conscientize people that you need to question where these things are coming from. I think that's a big problem as well. We also need to look from within ourselves, not to look from outside, because we are brought in the society which is for many years we've been trained to be aspirant, to to be selfish. Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Philip. Did you get a question, Jason? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a need to sort of look at the broader economic questions here and people's personal attitudes towards wealth. And I do think that in lots of societies, there's a tendency to value wealth no matter how that wealth was created, and whether it was created through gross exploitation or tax avoidance or both. That is definitely a problem. And in the specific case of Nike, I mean, you guys have been studying the broader aspects of global supply chains, but they contract out their work to subcontractors and don't take responsibility always for the working conditions in factories. But Nike is also incredibly abusive in terms of tax avoidance, and is currently facing charges in Europe for major tax avoidance scandals. And its logo, who people spend a lot of money to wear those shoes and look fashionable and look like they have a high income because they're able to buy those luxury goods. We're paying for the intellectual property of the silly little swoop. And I do think that people need to sort of raise their consciousness a little bit and not get suckered into that type of attitudes about wealth. And I think we have to be much more questioning about where people's wealth came from and whether it's legitimate or not. So I agree with that.
yeah, thanks, Jason, for that. Let's try if we can have one's question for Sebastian. Then after that, we'll have Tia. We still cannot hear you. So anyway, I messaged one and said we'll get his question through the chat. So in the meantime, I can call on Tia for her question. Hi, Tia. Did I get that right?
Yes. Hello, Benji. Hello, Jason, everybody. My question is very short. Well, we assume that, generally what Philip was mentioning is that the higher you pay, the greater the respect is expected. So it's not only one-way rule that I'm very conscious to pay my tax, and I also want to earn respect from that. So assuming that these big corporates agree for the 20% unitarian tax, wouldn't that be also a threat to the state? Well, at the moment we have very high income from the income tax. In Indonesia, we apply the progressive income tax based on your income value. Then you have this 5%, 15, and then the highest is 25. And for 20% it's like 25 million till 500 million rupiah, or I cannot I cannot exchange it in dollar, but it is a small amount with regard or in compared to a US based company. So question is very, very simple. How do you see the threats of this higher paid corporations in case that they fulfill their duty or follow this unitarian tax system, and how we can mitigate the risk that states get undermined by those payments? Thank you, Jason.
I think a key thing is we have to have much more transparency than exists in a lot of countries, and I think that we should have companies who are proudly saying that they contribute to the economy through their company tax payments. Right now, we have a lot of multinationals who pretend that they pay because they're taking credit for the amount of tax that their workers pay on the salaries that they make, or they take credit for the royalty payments that they make on the resources they're extracting. But those are not, I mean, I think we need to be looking at making that information public and publicly accessible in ways so that we can look at these companies and see genuinely what they contribute versus what types of profits and revenues that they're making in each country. So there are examples, I mean, in some countries, in the Philippines and in Bangladesh, there are publications, annual lists of who pays the largest amounts of corporate tax. In Australia, we have a disclosure of tax payments for every company with, I think, over 100 million or 200 million in revenue. And we can look at that every year. We get the data and we can see who pays what and who's not paying anything. And I think we need to have that, and we're pushing for those types of rules internationally and at the corporate level. One of the things that we're going to be trying to push for this year is getting shareholders to vote on proposals to require companies to disclose revenues, profits, number of workers, payroll, and taxes paid on a country-by-country basis. So we want to see that with Uber, with Amazon, with mining companies, and some of the big labor hire firms, as well as Amazon and Google and Facebook. So I think, having greater transparency about what is paid and actually making sure that transparency is not a false claim, because we do see lots of companies. I'm thinking of resource companies in particular making ridiculous claims about what taxes that they're paying. And really, when you look at it, you can't, if you're a resource company and you're paying the government in production sharing or royalty payments, that's not tax. That's paying for the product that you have the privilege to extract and export. But I mean, I think we need to be able to compare payments from multinationals across the board to see what it is. And I think we need to highlight in cases where we need to be making those comparisons about what does a worker who works for that company pay as a percentage of their income, and what does a company who makes, multi-millions, what are they paying as a percentage of their income, and make those direct comparisons that are easy for lots of people to understand and see. Because there are huge examples where, a cleaner in a shopping center is paying more tax than the multinational owner of that shopping center. And I think we need to sort of highlight those examples to show how unfair the system is and how those corporations can corrupt the political system by changing the rules, changing enforcement in their own favor. And then what happens is that the rest of us have to pay more for the services that we all need, including the companies that benefit from those public services and infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I guess that's a good idea. The thing that you mentioned, Jason, about comparing what an ordinary worker would be paying compared to what corporations are also paying. Yeah. So, do you have a follow-up, Tia? You have a
Yeah.
follow-up to your, okay, yeah. We'll
Sorry,
have you
Jason.
first and then
Um,
we'll have one's question.
Yes. So you assume that greater transparency and that the discipline of the corporates will generally benefit the public. How about the possibility that corporates try to corrupt the system and questioning the state sovereignty? As we know, the states have different GDP, and the politicians and corruptions, they are very much, they're like a pair of shoes. And where do we need to take a stance, and what can we do to mitigate this risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very real problem, and I think sadly, in virtually every country, the large corporates have so much political power and influence, and the system is sadly very corrupted. And they currently do have more influence than they should have. But I think that making sure that they're playing by a same set of rules and paying fairly on the income that they make is one way to control that, and making that information public. But I do think, I mean, corruption is a massive issue, and we need to look at not only the revenue coming in, but how governments are spending money as well. And so in a lot of countries, as big of an issue as the revenue is the subsidies that companies get. And it's governments giving away taxpayer monies to attract foreign investment. And that needs to stop. And we need much greater transparency on that. And a lot of the campaigning that we have been doing is looking at not just making sure that multinational companies pay their fair of taxes, but how the government, what companies are getting government spending as well, and making sure that that government spending is not ending up in tax havens, not lining executives' pockets, but is actually doing the services that that money was intended to do. So we've done a lot of work on aged care or nursing homes. And sadly, that money in lots of different countries we've looked at, in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, we're looking at France, New Zealand, that money is basically is ending up in tax havens, making shareholders super rich. And the workers who take care of the people and the people in those facilities are not getting the services that they need and deserve and respect. So I think we have to hold governments accountable as well as corporates.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Tia, too. If I would just like to add, in the Philippines, the tax authorities here generally publish the largest taxpayers. They don't publish everyone. Okay? Yeah. But of course, on the side of the workers, taxes are taken automatically through a system of withholding taxes, right? So in terms of corporations, they're asked to declare. So when we ordinarily talk to workers, isn't this a double standard? If you're a worker, the taxes automatically shaved off your wages, but for the corporations, they're asked to declare their income, and therefore in that way they can very well cheat or avoid paying their fair share, right? So anyway, so I got
if I can follow up on that.
Jason.
One, I mean, one specific example in the Philippines is that, and again, my research on this is several years old, but a few years ago, on the list of largest taxpayers, I think coming in at number 4 and number 5 were Chevron and Shell, and they operated the Malampaya gas projects. They actually didn't pay any tax whatsoever. The government of the Philippines paid the tax on their behalf out of the money it earned from the revenue sharing arrangement. So they claim to be the 4th and 5th largest taxpayers, but actually that money is lowering what the government of the Philippines is collecting from its own resource. And the exact same thing is happening in Bangladesh with Chevron and its gas fields there. It's the largest taxpayer in Bangladesh, but it's not actually, not 1 cent of that tax money is coming from the company. The government is paying the company's tax bill from its share of production from the contracts, which is, I mean, it's terrible. And particularly, I mean, in both Bangladesh and the Philippines, these are countries that are most subject to the, global warming and climate change. And you have these, fossil fuel companies destroying the environment and just taking the resource and not paying what they should be for that. Sorry, just a little tangent on the.
Yeah, but that's good. I'll make a note of that, Jason. Yeah. I have one question because unfortunately we can't hear him. So anyway, here, Jason, this is one question. Is there anything new or is there any new strategy regarding tax havens? Their very existence should pose a threat to unitary efforts regarding tax regulation. Did you get that, Jason?
Yeah. So I think that the proposal around a minimum tax reform will go, I mean, it may take some years, but it will go quite some ways to making tax havens obsolete, because if the home country of that multinational is going to take the tax regardless of where it's booked anyway, the idea of booking your profits in a place like Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, lots of other places, there's really no point if at the end of the day you're going to have to pay tax on that anyway under a minimum tax proposal. So I do think that that's very encouraging that the days of tax havens will begin to decline if that minimum tax goes into effect, because it sort of takes away the incentive. Ultimately, I do think that what we need is a unitary approach where that doesn't matter. So the minimum tax is still a minimum tax based on profits earned on that in that country. A unitary approach would look at a global profits of a company and then allocate revenues based on a formula. And as I spoke about before, hopefully one that weighs a lot of factors that sort of distributes that based on where actual economic activity is taking place, not just sales, but where things are being made and produced and designed as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. If you have any follow-up one, so you just try to chat the question, follow-up question. Here is from Hanita Biola. It's actually a friend from the Philippines. It's 3 questions, but it's all related. So how would multilateral or global tax reforms be feasible given that individual companies race to the bottom in terms of reducing taxes of multinational companies? What is the best way then to press companies to act collectively? And finally, what are the crucial pressure points for the progressive movement?
I'm gonna start with the third one and then see if I can move backwards on that. But I think it's, in order for us to drive changes to national, regional, global tax systems, I think we have to continue to expose what companies currently get away with, and that the only way to drive reform is to actually show what the problem is and really, point fingers and expose what individual multinationals are getting away with now. And I think we have to sort of name and shame them and clearly show what the problem is and point fingers at that, because that's really what drives political pressure, public opinion, and political pressure is when people realize how ridiculous the system is, where a multinational company can get away with paying nothing and a worker has to pay 25, 30, 35% of their salary in tax. And as Benjamin pointed out before, it's sort of, there's no choice that comes, if you're on a payroll, that money is taken out as you earn it, right? Where companies can just cook their books and make things up about what's profit and what's not. And we know, and sadly, most of those tricks are still legal. So we need to kind of expose what's going on so that we can begin to change the laws at a national and local level. I also think that governments shouldn't be. I'm talking about when governments spend money. Governments have huge amount of influence and power in terms of the money that they spend. A lot of it, sadly, far too much ends up in corporate pockets as well. And governments shouldn't be signing contracts and giving away money to multinationals who don't pay the fair share of taxes globally and in that particular country and jurisdiction. And that can happen at any level of government. If you have a large school district or a state or local government, they can all have policies which require kind of fair tax payment or transparency as a condition of receiving money. And for example, just to sort of point one finger, Amazon has a huge business and it makes far more profits selling cloud computing services than it does in sort of online retail business. And governments are a huge purchaser, and they should be requiring Amazon to disclose its business model on a country by country basis as a condition of receiving any government contracts. I mean, I know from conversations with uni around Amazon that Swiss unions have been able to require that if they got a government contract, it required them to have a collective bargaining agreement. So those types of conditions from government contracts are very possible, and would think something that we need to look at.
Well, yeah, great that you mentioned that. So maybe we can get back to that later about how unions elsewhere have been involved in tax justice and what have they, what like concrete examples. So, but before that, I see the hand of Afua. Did I get that right? So you have a question, and then Stephanie again after Afua. Hi, Afua. You have a question, Afua? I will get back to you. So Stephanie first.
I don't have any further question.
Oh, okay. So I see one's hand up. So, I think one sent another question, but through chat. So Jason, I'm gonna read it. So in this minimum tax system,
Hello.
Yeah, Afua, is that you?
Yes, please.
Yeah, do you have a question? Yeah, hi Afua. Okay. I'll get back to you, Afua. I'll read one's question first.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to know, do we have any new? All right.
You're not coming in clear, Afua. Let's try maybe if you can chat the question, or maybe we'll try again after a while, right? So anyway, this is the question from Juan. So Jason, I'm gonna read it. So in this minimum tax system, which considers how much a company profits on each country market, is there any kind of leadership to be expected from countries that represent the greatest demand of these goods and services? I say this because those are the ones which can exert bigger pressure. Does that sound okay, Jason?
So can you just repeat the first part of that question? Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna read it verbatim. So in this minimum tax system, which considers how much a company profits on each country market? Is there any kind of leadership to be expected from countries that represent the greatest demand of these goods and services?
Yeah, well, I do think that there are several countries that are pushing for a higher minimum tax rate to be included, which I think we absolutely, 15% is not enough and it needs to be higher. So I'm hoping that the final negotiations push that higher. And I think there are several countries out there that are pushing for high, including the US, because it sees the problem of tax competition. It has a domestic demand to raise revenue, and for better or worse, that drives the global process because there's an explicit need in the US to raise revenue. The question is whether that revenue gets shared fairly with other markets as well. So I do think that there is and will be continuing push to raise that from the current 15% to something higher. I'd love to see 25%, but I think if we got to 21%, that would be a major step forward. And I do think even if the current agreement is at 15%, I think that there is an opportunity over time to push that higher. And politically, you have a number of countries that are below 15, like Ireland is a prime example in the European Union. Its corporate tax rate is currently 12.5. So it is a country that is, and there's several of them in Europe. Hungary is another. There may be a greater possibility of starting at 15 and moving it higher over time to give countries some period of adjustment there. I know that there are a couple of countries that have rejected the deal so far, and I think rejected it for good, and also I think in order to pressure for a better arrangements. So I think Nigeria had rejected it, and perhaps Kenya as well. I'm not sure if either of those countries has changed its position. So some countries like Ireland had rejected it because they thought it was too tough. And some companies and a few countries have rejected it because it's not tough enough, and definitely needs to be strengthened. And I think that there is still part of the problem, particularly with the Pillar 1, is that it was intended to tax the tech giants. And frankly, it's very complicated and very hard we don't even know the full set of details yet about how it will ultimately be implemented. But it's complex and it's built on top of a global tax system that is already broken. So it's adding another layer on top of a broken system. And I think if we were to move towards a full unitary tax for the very largest multinationals, it would be much fairer, transparent, and easier for all countries to implement.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for that. Yeah, Afua, you're not coming in clear, so we cannot understand what you're saying. My suggestion is, can you chat your question, Afua? Because you're not coming in clear. Yeah, so I think we finally lost her. So, but as a follow-up, Jason, because apparently what's happening is that the tax negotiations are happening at the level of the OECD. Yep. And then, of course, you're saying that it's still lacking. And then there's, of course, opposition from countries that's saying it's too much. Others saying it's too little. So what do you think? Is there still relevance in pushing for tax reforms within that framework, negotiations within the OECD? Or alternatively, should there be talks at the UN level, or otherwise should there just be unilateral actions or a combination? Yeah. So what do you think?
I think some combination. Look, I mean, the OECD shouldn't be the forum where these discussions are taking place. This should absolutely be something that happens through the United Nations. but I think it would be very naive to think that we wouldn't have political influence of the rich nations in a United Nations process as well. So clearly, I mean, the OECD, it is the club of rich nations, and I think that this kind of inclusive framework that they've developed is a bit of a farce. I mean, it's inclusive in that countries have signed up to it, but I think we all understand that the political reality is that the big global countries in the global north, the US, the UK, the European Union, all wield a huge amount of power in the OECD forums. But I do think they would wield that same power through the UN as well. Having said that, I think that the UN is the place where those conversations should ultimately be happening. And I do think it's worthwhile to continue to put pressure to increase the capacity of the UN to have those discussions and to develop proposals that are much more informed by debates and realities in the global south, and that end up with a system that ultimately has greater fairness. I think it's a mistake to not engage with the OECD process and push it as far as it can possibly go in terms of having the best positive outcome for all countries. So I think it's definitely worth continuing to engage. I think just kind of throwing stones at it because it's the OECD is not necessarily productive. I accept all the criticisms that are in the current negotiations, but I think it's in our best interest to push that to the best outcome that's possible within that framework and then continue to build on it. I mean, tax reform, it's going to be a long process, and it will be years and years of further work to kind of continue to push things in the right direction. And I think in order for us to do that, I think there's huge opportunity to push things unilaterally at the national level and at a regional level, wherever that is possible. So there's part of the Pillar 1 proposal excludes countries from implementing various digital service taxes, but there's lots of things that countries can continue to do to move in the right direction. One is sort of greater transparency and disclosure of multinational tax payments and profits. But also just, I think there's lots of innovative things that countries can do unilaterally to move things in the right direction. And I think we only got to the process we're at now because lots of countries began to unilaterally implement digital service taxes. That created the pressure where not just the OECD and individual countries, but companies were saying this is a chaotic process and would be better off with the multilateral solution, even if we have to lose something. And so I think that ultimately, I think that the chaos is a helpful path to push things to ultimately towards a better multilateral solution. And this current round of tax negotiations is just that. It's the beginning of a process. It's not the end. And the kind of demand and the need for international corporate tax reform is going to go on for many, many years, where these proposals are a long way off from fixing all of the problems. So hopefully there's some positive steps forward. But I think the global tax reform is going to be happening, hopefully, and moving in the right direction for many, many years to come.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for that. I guess there's a lot of insights in what Jason has said. So, any questions from the room? Oh, we didn't get any question from Apu, unfortunately. So, too bad. I think there's a problem with the connection. So yeah, it's we have 9 more minutes. So I guess we have time for a couple of questions from anybody in the room. How about this, Jason? I've always I kind of have an idea in my mind about this fair and transparent formula for a unitary tax. Although, I mean, I'm kind of used to thinking in a formula, it's something like y is equal to x something something. Although I've also read that there's no one has actually proposed any actual formula. But can you just expound on how can we actually do this unitary tax on global profits? So it's just so we can wrap our heads around it. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you need a formula that is clear, but also the majority of, so there is a unitary system that exists within the United States and between the states, and that formula is entirely based on sales. The discussions that are coming out around Pillar 1 are also the sort of distribution formula is entirely based on sales, and I think that is unfair. It has to factor in labor, workers, and production, right? So if you're not including, if you're just including where things are sold, that's clearly disadvantaging countries where lots of production and labor takes place. So I think a formula has to, at a minimum, include some distributional factor for where production occurs, where labor occurs, and where things are being made. So sales is clearly a factor, and probably more for some than others. I mean, as I was saying before, I think population is an interesting thing to look at. I mean, if you're looking at a company like Google or Facebook, which are almost universal, right, in terms of their international reach, why not look at a company and distribute its revenues based on purely on population? Like, that's the cleanest, simplest, fairest way I can think of. And you know, if there are a limited number of Facebook users in Burkina Faso, so what? Why not? When you get, and I think, in terms of fairness too, when you get to the scale of some of these multinationals, they have such a kind of monopoly power that they should be actually taxed at a, like, as there is with individuals, there's a progressive tax rate. So if a company reaches a certain size, why aren't we, essentially taxing its excess profits that it's able to derive from being a monopoly? And so I think that there is a lot of arguments to be made that a unitary tax could be done in a sectoral way, and that I think that the tech sector and the tech giants are the best place to start, because there's already a lot of political attention and focus on them, and they are growing faster, and frankly have benefited more from the current pandemic than just about any other economic sector, right? As people do more meetings like this and are more online and more reliant on the internet, Zoom is doing very well, as is Microsoft and Facebook, and because of their success, they should be paying more.
Yeah, I have a follow-up to that, but before that, maybe somebody else would like to ask a question. Oh, so Edlira has one. Yeah.
No, Jason, just since we are also wrapping up, if you can tell us a bit, what are the unions doing, and how is sector working with the global unions and other unions around the world? And I mean, can participants in our course coming from the unions or other progressive forces contact sector, and what kind of help and assistance do you actually provide? Yeah,
so I'll answer that in a couple ways. So one, I'll just sort of throw back on some of the work we did with unions before SICTAR was set up, and then I'll come and talk about some of the work that we're doing now and plan to do into the future, if that's all right. So, I mean, one of the things that we did before SICTAR was set up was we went after Chevron and Exxon, and we did that on behalf of unions because Chevron was trying to bust the union. Literally, they were taking them to court and trying to bankrupt them out of existence because of a strike action that they took, which the courts ruled illegal. And so was the impetus for us getting into their tax affairs. And so us exposing these workers are literally offshore and pretty high paid. And so nobody really cared about their plight. But when we could tell the Australian public that this company was stealing the annual education budget, then it becomes an issue that everybody cares about, and everybody was supporting the fight against Chevron. And so we've made Chevron and Exxon and the rest of the oil sector cough up another $16 billion in tax revenue. It's not enough, but $16 billion is significant. And that's now, helping to pay for our schools and hospitals and COVID vaccinations and all that. So that's an example of sort of taking, adding the tax issue as a tool for unions to win on an industrial level. And that's, we're keen to do more of that. We recently, this is something that didn't see the light of day, but a union was on strike with a multinational called General Mills. So they're a big multinational food production company. And we had prepared an expose about their tax avoidance. They settled the strike and we didn't use that. So, but we had that in our hand and ready to go. If the strike wasn't settled, we would have been, in the media and with politicians the next day to slam them on their tax avoidance. So we've put that back in our pocket because it wasn't needed at the time. But that's the approach that SICTAR takes, because we work with unions and we use things in a way that are strategic to the cause of those unions. So in terms of areas moving forward, we've done a lot of work and we'll continue to do a lot of work, as I mentioned before, around aged care or nursing homes. So we've done a lot of work over many years in Australia, and we're now working with unions in the UK. We have a report on the largest nursing home company owned by some of the world's richest people. And that'll come out in October, maybe November. But again, the UK government has announced that it's going to tax people to fund social care in the UK. And I'm all for more money going into that sector. But what our report shows is that the biggest company is owned by a bunch of thieves who are stealing that money and sending it to the Cayman Islands and then crying poor to local authorities to get more money during COVID. And that money is going, it's not hiring more staff, it's not taking care of the elderly. They're dying in record numbers and did throughout COVID. And these people just continue to siphon the money offshore through dividend payments that literally go to the Cayman Islands. They charge themselves tens of millions of dollars in rent that goes off to the Cayman Islands. And they borrow money from themselves at interest rates of 15%, and that interest payment's tax-free, goes off to the Cayman Islands. So here's a system that's utterly broken in the UK, and it's not just the UK. It's an example that happens in a lot of countries. It's true in Australia, it's true in the United States, it's true in France and across Europe. Why do we put more money into a system where the private companies who operate that system are avoiding their taxes and basically making undue, profits out of people's misery? So we're going to continue to work with unions in France to expose some of the largest nursing home operators across Europe. And I think I mentioned before, we're looking at shareholder resolutions. We've done a lot of work on Uber, and we'll continue to do work on Uber as a company that is kind of undermining global labor practices worldwide. It does that through a tax structure in the Netherlands, and we're working with the Dutch trade unions on that, but also partnering with unions in lots of other places to sort of challenge Uber's business model. And with all these companies, we're going to take this issue to their shareholders and ask their shareholders to require the companies to disclose on a country by country basis what taxes they pay, but also revenues and profits, and number of workers and payroll in each country. And we think that's important for unions, that's important for civil society, but it's also important for the people whose money are invested in that company. How could you invest in Uber when you don't know which country? It's not currently reported, right? They talk about most US multinationals report on the US and the rest of the world. And that's just not, doesn't give an investor the right kind of information to understand what the risks are and where the future growth of this company might be. So that's true of lots of multinationals. And we think the timing is right to push that agenda. We're focused on tech companies. like Amazon and others like Accenture, IBM, Oracle. These are sort of the lesser known tech companies, but that have huge government contracts, and will work with PSI and with Uni around procurement issues, around tech contracts with governments. We have a report coming out around McDonald's and their new tax avoidance structures that we've done with union partners as well. So McDonald's, the calculation in that report suggests that 23% of the price of a Big Mac is intellectual property. So that's, you know, like the cost of the intellectual property, which is used for tax avoidance, is equal to the labor costs of producing that hamburger. And, you know, like there's no intellectual property in a hamburger, sorry. But the system currently allows people to extract that wealth through royalty payments. And we need to put an end to that. The other kind of major, we have a report coming out on Glencore and how Glencore abuses the global tax system. So Glencore, in my view, is probably the most evil multinational in the world that ever has been. Not widely known in terms of its brand name, but they are pure evil and have been union busting and tax avoiding since the very beginning. So we're working with partners on that, the Tax Justice Network globally. We've reached out to Industrial and other unions, and with a group called Publish What You Pay, exposing kind of how Glencore abuses the global tax system. And the other major area is labor hire. So people may not realize, but so Uber and Amazon are changing the nature of work globally. But so are labor hire companies, and some of these companies are amongst the largest employers in the world now, and really, like, it's amazing. In lots of countries, they're doing work across every economic sector, and in many countries, they're doing a lot of public sector work. In Australia, for example, about 1/5, 20% of the money spent on payroll in the federal public sector goes directly to labor hire companies. And so we're undermining the government's own capacity by hiring contractors to do specialized work and not maintaining that skill and experience within the public sector. So we're working with unions here to kind of expose that and campaign against that. We've stopped some privatization or outsourcing efforts. There are many more, and we'll keep working with unions to fight that. And so these companies, like, the biggest ones are Randstad, which is Dutch-based, Adecco, which is Swiss-based, and then there are several. Manpower is a US company, and then there are 3 or 4 Japanese multinationals that are massive and growing, and they probably operate in your market, but they operate under different brand names of companies that they've bought over time, and they've grown through acquisitions. And, you know, they're really undermining labor standards in every sector, in the public sector, mining, manufacturing, everywhere, service sector, across the board. So we're wanting to use the tax avoidance as a way to highlight the problems with multinational labor hire. Sorry, I've been ranting for a long time. I'll shut up.
But that's a good list of examples, right, on how unions can use the issue of taxation and tax justice to help labor struggles, right, or leverage labor disputes. There's just a short question here from one. You mentioned Chevron in Australia. He's asking, is there a website mentioning that case? You mentioned a labor dispute concerning Chevron in Australia, or just Google it. It will.
So it was a few years back, and we used to have a dedicated website, but we no longer have that website. But there will be a lot of media on the Chevron tax dispute and the Chevron worker dispute. It was with the MUA in Western Australia on the world's largest LNG, liquefied natural gas project called the Gorgon Project. And so we generated lots of media and political attention on that case for a few years, but it's a few years back now. The other thing we did with Chevron that's still live and still going on is that we filed an OECD complaint against the violation of the guidelines for multinationals. And we filed that complaint in the Netherlands, and we did it with the Dutch Trade Union Federation, with PSI, Industrial, and the ITF. So those three GUFs plus FNV as the lead complainant. And this has finally and formally been accepted by the national contact point in the Netherlands. And so they are doing an official investigation into the use of shell companies in the Netherlands to avoid tax in, what are the countries? Nigeria, Argentina, and Venezuela. And initial drafts of that complaint also, I've looked at Indonesia, but they no longer have the big production license that they used to have in Indonesia. It's been taken back by Pertamina, the state-owned oil company, which was very good. And we looked at the UK too, because they were avoiding tax on North Sea oil production, but that's.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for that. Unfortunately, it's 5:07, and I don't want to take too much of everybody's time. But just like a final point, in the additional readings, there's a bit of discussion there in the article by Jason about Uber, so you can just check it out. So I guess we should end with that. Yeah, and thank you, Jason, for those great inputs and insights, a lot of information, and of course, everybody too for your active participation.